Imagine it is the 15th of January 2003. You are a 42-year-old elementary school teacher living in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. You wake up at 5:30 in the morning, the same time you have woken up every day for the past 16 years. Your apartment is small, 2 bedrooms, paid for with a government-backed loan you took out in 1994 when the economy was booming. And everyone believed the good times would never end. You have about 12,000 ringgit in your savings account. That is the equivalent of roughly 3,000 US dollars at the time. Your salary covers food and your children's school fees. You also send a modest amount to your aging mother in Penang every month. You are not wealthy, but you are stable. You have a pension, you have a roof, you have dignity, and you remember, with a cold feeling in your stomach, what it felt like just 5 years earlier when all of that nearly vanished overnight. If you have ever wondered how a country drowning in debt, abandoned by international financial institutions, and mocked by Western economists, managed to climb out of crisis on its own terms and emerge stronger than almost every neighbor that followed the prescribed playbook, stay with me. What you are about to hear is not a theory. It is a pattern. It has happened before, and it always ends with a question that nobody in power wants to answer. If you find value in this kind of historical clarity, subscribing takes 2 seconds and keeps you ahead of what most people never see coming. Because here is what happened to that teacher and to the entire nation she called home. In 1997, the Asian financial crisis hit Malaysia like a freight train. The ringgit lost nearly half its value in months. The stock market collapsed by more than 75% from its peak. Foreign investors pulled billions of dollars out almost overnight. Banks teetered. Construction cranes stood still across the Kuala Lumpur skyline like metal skeletons. And the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, which is the global lender of last resort that steps in when countries run out of money, came knocking with its standard prescription: cut government spending, raise interest rates, open your markets wider, sell off state assets, accept our loans and our conditions. Thailand accepted, Indonesia accepted, South Korea accepted. Malaysia said no. And what happened next is one of the most important and least understood economic stories of the past 50 years. This is the story of how one country escaped debt and became rich without IMF help, and why the lessons of that escape matter more today than they did the day it happened. Before we go further, there is something important to understand. The IMF is not a charity. It is not a global rescue service that shows up out of kindness. The IMF is a lending institution, backed primarily by wealthy nations, especially the United States, Europe, and Japan. When a country borrows from the IMF, the money comes with strings. These strings are called conditionalities, which is a fancy word for the list of rules a country must follow to keep receiving funds. These rules almost always include the same recipe. Cut public spending, which means less money for schools, hospitals, and infrastructure. Raise interest rates, which makes it more expensive for businesses and ordinary people to borrow money. Privatize state-owned companies, which means selling government assets, often to foreign buyers, at bargain prices. And open markets to foreign capital, which means letting outside investors move money in and out freely. The theory behind this recipe is straightforward. Discipline the economy, restore confidence, let the market correct itself. But the reality on the ground has often looked very different from the theory on the whiteboard. Think of it this way. If your house is on fire, the IMF prescription is essentially to tear down half the walls to stop the fire from spreading. It might work, but you are left standing in the rain with half a house. Malaysia looked at that offer and decided to fight. Malaysia decided to fight the fire a different way. And that decision changed the country's future. This brings us directly to the first major point, the moment Malaysia broke from the herd. In September 1998, Malaysian Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad did something that nearly every Western economist said was economic suicide. He pegged the ringgit to the US dollar at a fixed rate of 3.8 ringgit per dollar. He imposed capital controls, which means he made it illegal for foreign investors to pull their money out for 12 months. He fired his deputy prime minister and finance minister, Anwar Ibrahim, who had been pushing for IMF-style reforms. And he told the world, essentially, that Malaysia would handle its own crisis its own way. The reaction from the global financial establishment was swift and brutal. The Economist magazine ran stories questioning Mahathir's sanity. Western credit agencies downgraded Malaysia's debt. Paul Krugman initially criticized the approach, though he would eventually soften his stance. The conventional wisdom was clear. Malaysia had just sealed its own coffin. But look at what happened next. Within a year, the Malaysian economy stabilized. By 1999, GDP growth returned, hitting 6.1%. The stock market began to recover. Banks that had been on the edge of collapse were restructured using a government agency. This agency was called Dana Harta, which was essentially Malaysia's version of a bad bank. Dana Harta bought up the toxic loans, the loans that were never going to be repaid, from the banking system. This cleared the books. It let healthy banks start lending again. It kept the financial plumbing of the country working. And here is the part that matters most for ordinary people. Mahathir did not raise interest rates to punishing levels. Because he ignored the IMF demands in Thailand, Indonesia, and South Korea, Malaysian businesses could still borrow money. Factories stayed open, workers kept their jobs, the teacher in Kuala Lumpur kept her salary. Her pension fund did not collapse. The pain was real, but it was not catastrophic. By 2005, Malaysia had largely recovered. It had not sold off its major state assets at fire sale prices. It had not surrendered control of its monetary policy to an outside institution. And it had not taken on crushing long-term debt. The country had fought the fire without tearing down the walls. This leads to the second part of this story, which requires looking at countries that said yes to the IMF. If a doctor gave the same medicine to 3 different patients and all 3 got worse before they got better, and a 4th patient refused the medicine entirely and recovered faster, what would you think about the medicine? Drop your answer in the comments. Seriously. Because what I am about to show you next changes everything. Thailand was the first domino to fall in the 1997 Asian crisis. The Thai baht collapsed in July 1997. The baht lost more than half its value against the dollar. Thailand turned to the IMF for a $17 billion rescue. In return, Thailand was required to close dozens of finance companies, slash government spending, and raise interest rates sharply. The result was devastating. Thai GDP contracted by 10.5% in 1998. Unemployment more than tripled. Hundreds of thousands of Thai workers migrated back to rural villages after losing factory and construction jobs in Bangkok. Small and medium businesses, the backbone of the economy, were crushed by interest rates exceeding 20%. A shopkeeper in Bangkok, with a healthy business, suddenly could not afford payments because the interest rate on his loan doubled. Not because his business failed, but because of IMF-mandated policy. Indonesia's experience was even worse. The IMF provided a rescue package of over $40 billion. President Suharto was forced to sign terms in a famous photograph. IMF Managing Director Michel Camdesis stood over him with crossed arms as Suharto hunched over the document. That image became a symbol of national humiliation across Asia. Indonesia was required to eliminate subsidies on fuel and food. They closed 16 banks in a single day and opened the economy to foreign ownership. The bank closures caused mass panic. Indonesians rushed to withdraw their money from every bank they could reach. The bank runs made the crisis exponentially worse. Indonesian GDP fell by 13.1% in 1998. The rupiah lost more than 80% of its value. Inflation hit nearly 60%. The price of basic goods like rice, cooking oil, and milk skyrocketed. Riots broke out across the country. Over 1,000 people died in the May 1998 riots in Jakarta alone. Suharto was forced to resign after 31 years in power. The social fabric of the country was torn apart. Much of it could be traced back to the abrupt, one-size-fits-all conditions imposed from outside. South Korea had a somewhat different experience, but the pattern held. The IMF provided a $57 billion package. South Korea was required to open financial markets, restructure conglomerates called chaebols, and allow foreign ownership of banks. The short-term pain was severe. Korean GDP fell by 5.5% in 1998. Unemployment doubled. Koreans participated in a gold collection campaign where ordinary citizens donated personal gold jewelry to help pay the national debt. It was a display of extraordinary patriotism, but also extraordinary desperation. South Korea did recover strongly, but the recovery came at a cost that is rarely discussed. Foreign ownership of Korean banks went from 12% to over 30%. Major Korean companies were acquired by foreign investors at crisis-level prices. The wealth transfer was enormous. South Korea paid off its IMF loan early, by 2001, and its economy grew impressively in the years that followed. But many Korean economists argue that the country gave away too much and that the conditions were unnecessarily harsh. Now, put all 3 of these stories next to Malaysia. Thailand, Indonesia, and South Korea all took the IMF medicine. All 3 experienced deeper recessions than Malaysia. All 3 experienced greater social disruption and significant transfers of national assets. Malaysia, the one that said no, had a shallower recession and recovered on a similar timeline while retaining control. Malaysia kept its banking system and key industries in domestic hands. This is not speculation. These are the numbers. For years, the official narrative from Washington was that Malaysia's approach was reckless. That narrative has collapsed. Most people will never know what you now know. Most people will keep trusting systems they do not understand. If you're still here, you're not most people. Hit subscribe. The next section is the part textbooks never include. Observe the pattern. When a country faces a crisis, it has 2 basic choices. Option 1 is to borrow and follow a script. Option 2 is to impose your own controls, take the hit to your reputation, and manage the crisis from inside. Option 1 is presented as the only choice. Option 2 is condemned as dangerous populism or economic ignorance. But the historical record tells a different story. The mechanism underneath is something economists call the impossible trinity. The impossible trinity means that a country can only have 2 out of 3 things at the same time. Those things are a fixed exchange rate, free movement of capital, and an independent monetary policy. If you want to control your currency and set your own interest rates, you must restrict the free movement of money. That is exactly what Malaysia did. It pegged its currency and it controlled capital flows. In doing so, it kept the ability to set its own interest rates at a level that did not destroy its economy. Thailand, Indonesia, and South Korea gave up that control. They let capital flow freely and let the IMF set the terms. And the result was that their interest rates were set not to help their own citizens, but to reassure foreign investors. The foreign investors came first, the citizens came second. This is not a judgment, this is a description of what happened. The pattern repeats across decades and continents. It happened in Latin America in the 1980s. It happened in Russia in the 1990s. It happened in Greece in 2015. The mechanism is always the same. A country in crisis borrows from outside. The lender demands conditions that prioritize the lender's interests. The borrowing country's citizens bear the heaviest cost. The country recovers eventually, but it recovers with less sovereignty, less ownership of its own assets, and more debt than it started with. Malaysia broke that cycle. It said no to the lender. It paid a price in reputation. It was called irresponsible, but it kept its house. And this is where history gets uncomfortable. Because the people who paid the highest price in every one of these crises were never the ones who caused them. In Thailand, Indonesia, South Korea, and every other country that has gone through an IMF program, the pattern of who suffers is consistent. The middle class gets hollowed out. In Indonesia in 1998, middle-class families who had spent decades building small businesses, saving for retirement, and investing in their children's education, watched their life savings evaporate in months. The rupiah went from about 2,400 per dollar to nearly 17,000 per dollar at its worst. A family that had saved the equivalent of $50,000 suddenly had savings worth less than $8,000 in real purchasing power. Pensioners, people who had already finished working and were living on fixed incomes, were devastated. Their pensions were denominated in the local currency. When the currency collapsed and prices skyrocketed, their monthly pension checks could barely buy food. In South Korea, small business owners were crushed by the interest rate hikes. A restaurant owner in Seoul, who had a loan to expand her business, saw her monthly payment double almost overnight. She did not fail because customers stopped coming. She failed because the cost of her debt became impossible. Meanwhile, the people who walked away from these crises, not just intact but wealthier, were almost always the same type. They were people with access to hard currency, meaning US dollars or other stable foreign currencies. They were people with assets that held value regardless of currency movements, such as real estate in prime locations, stakes in export-oriented companies, or gold. And they were people with connections, political or financial, that gave them advance warning to move their money out before the worst hit. In Indonesia, well-connected business owners moved their capital to Singapore months before the crisis peaked. In Thailand, foreign investors who had pushed the baht to its breaking point through speculative bets made billions when the currency collapsed. The crisis was not equally distributed. It never is. The ordinary teacher, the shopkeeper, the factory worker, the retiree, they had no mechanism to protect themselves. They could not move money offshore. They could not hedge their currency risk. They did not even know what hedging meant. They trusted the system, and the system failed them in direct proportion to how much they trusted it. The question is not whether this pattern will repeat. History has already answered that. The only question is whether you will see it before it sees you. If this channel helps you think differently about the world you live in, subscribe. It costs nothing, and it might change everything. Now let us talk about what the people who came through these storms actually did. And let me be very clear, this is not financial advice, this is historical observation. The historical record shows that those who came through this period largely shared 3 characteristics. First, they had low personal debt relative to their income. In Malaysia, families who had avoided taking on excessive debt during the boom years of the early 1990s were far better positioned to weather the downturn. They did not face the crushing weight of loan repayments at a time when income was shrinking. The families who had stretched to buy bigger houses, fancier cars, and more expensive lifestyles on borrowed money were the ones who fell hardest. Second, they had some portion of their wealth outside the banking system or outside their local currency. This did not necessarily mean foreign bank accounts. In many cases, it meant physical assets, land, gold, a small family business that generated real goods or services that people needed, regardless of what the currency was doing. In Malaysia and across Southeast Asia, families with agricultural land or small food businesses weathered the crisis far better than families whose entire net worth was in bank deposits and stock market investments. Third, and this is the one that is hardest to quantify but perhaps the most important, they had knowledge. They understood, even at a basic level, that financial systems are not permanent and that currencies are not guaranteed. They did not panic and make catastrophic decisions at the worst possible moment. In South Korea, during the darkest days of the crisis, some families sold their homes at the absolute bottom of the market out of fear, only to watch prices recover within 2 to 3 years. The families who held on, who understood that crises are temporary even when they feel permanent, retained their wealth. This is not about being smart. It is about being informed. And the uncomfortable truth is that the information that matters most during a crisis is the information that is hardest to find before the crisis arrives. By the time everyone understands what is happening, the damage is already done. The antidote to panic is not courage. It is knowledge acquired before the panic begins. Now let us bring this full circle. Let us come back to the teacher in Kuala Lumpur. By 2003, her life had changed in ways both visible and invisible. Her salary had recovered. Her pension was intact. The construction cranes across the Kuala Lumpur skyline were moving again. The Petronas Twin Towers, completed in 1998, right in the middle of the crisis, stood as a symbol of a country that refused to stop building even when the world told it to shrink. Malaysia's GDP per capita, which is the average economic output per person, grew from roughly $3,800 in 1998 to over $5,000 by 2005, and would continue climbing to over $12,000 by 2019. The country was not without problems. It still had inequality, it still had political tensions, it still had structural challenges in its economy, but it had something that many of its neighbors had lost. It had sovereignty over its own economic decisions. It had a banking system still largely owned by Malaysians. It had key industries still controlled domestically. And it had a population that, while shaken by the crisis, had not been gutted by it. The lesson of Malaysia is not that the IMF is always wrong. The lesson is not that capital controls are always right. The lesson is simpler and more profound than that. When a country in crisis prioritizes the well-being of its own citizens over the approval of international creditors, the short-term cost is condemnation. But the long-term reward is independence. Malaysia traded reputation for sovereignty. It traded approval for control. And in the decades that followed, the trade proved to be one of the best economic decisions any developing nation has made in the modern era. The deeper lesson, the one that echoes across every crisis in history, is that the rules presented as universal and unbreakable are often neither. They are choices. They are policies designed by specific people with specific interests. And when a country or an individual understands that the rules are choices, they gain the most valuable thing in any crisis: options. Today, as global debt levels reach historic highs, as currencies face pressures not seen in decades, and as the IMF continues to operate with the same basic playbook it used in 1997, the story of Malaysia is not just history. It is a mirror. The conditions that created the Asian financial crisis, excessive borrowing, speculative capital flows, currency mismatches, and blind faith in systems that serve insiders first, are not relics of the past. They are features of the present. The country names may change. The currency names may change. The faces in the photographs may change, but the mechanism underneath is the same river, flowing in the same direction, carving the same channels it has always carved. This is historical and educational analysis. It is not financial advice. Every individual situation is different. Please consult a qualified professional before making any financial decision. This video is not for everyone. Most people will dismiss it. But if one person in your life needs to hear this, share it with them. Not because it will change the world, because it might change their world. Subscribe for more, and I will see you in the next one. See 2026, Script Scene Splitter AI.